Thank you very much. It's always hard to follow wine, steak, fish, and auctions. So I am honored that you stayed awake and listened. And I want to say thank you for your support. I want to also welcome now Tracy Swartout, Deputy Superintendent of Mount Rainier National Park, who every single day has her feet on the ground helping make sure these places stay special. So thank you.
Thanks, Hillary. To adjust this for my height. So, who the hell follows Saxon Parks? If I had longer time, I would tell you a story about a call I got at Congaree when I first became superintendent there. It was someone who was, I will tell it now. There was someone who wanted, now this is the Bible Belt. They were calling because they wanted to know if I'd heard of procreation recreation. I had not, but it was an interesting story. Okay. So I'm Tracy Swartout. I'm the Deputy Superintendent at Mount Rainier National Park, and I just want to say it's my pleasure to follow Hillary. Thank you so much for your words of inspiration and for all that you do for the state of Washington and also for the national parks, and also to all the green and gray and the volunteers in this room. It's just me standing up here, but I could be any of the others who are in the audience, those who are still in the Park Service, those who are here sneaking around in their retired state like Randy King and others. So there's a whole village of people. There's a whole village of people behind me. I've spent about 20 years working with the national parks. So I'm just about at the midpoint in my career, which is hard for me to believe, and I'm also sort of in that midlife pocket. I find I still have young kids at home, but I also have aging parents 3,000 miles away. And it's at this point in my life I'm doing a lot of thinking. I'm thinking about how the hell I got to where I am, what my children are going to become. Are they going to be in technology all the time? What's going to be in the technology? And what influences are going to lead my children in the future? But I'm also thinking about the next generation of the conservation movement and how we, as a larger conservation community, are going to create and inspire that next generation of diverse park stewards as we start that long path to the Park Service bicentennial in 2116. That's going to be a milestone that none of the 500 folks in this room are going to see. So how do we ensure that there are voices to carry on the support that Hillary mentioned and that all of us are here to demonstrate? How do we ensure that in 100 years the voices are heard? Certainly my husband Tom and I have a role in our own children's futures, but we also know that we're not alone. We know that there are people who are influencing our children and the next generation. They might be teachers, they might be pastors, they might be YMCA caregivers, and from every face in the globe, they will have some kind of influence. So how do we as a conservation community connect with them to ensure that many more rooms like this are filled in the next 10 years, 20 years, or 100 years? So if you can't tell from my accent, I did not grow up around here. I just recently went back to South Carolina, so it's back in full force. I grew up in South Carolina's capital city, Columbia. When I was graduating from high school, less than 59% of the people ages 25 and above had a high school diploma. We've gotten up into the 80s finally, and it's been a long road there. In my family, we spent our time split between the city and the rural parts of the state, and we were connected to the family business. I was being raised by my grandparents, and they grew up on farms, and they were very connected to the land. They were raising me because my mom worked 2 jobs to put my dad through school. And I'm going to guess that about half the kids in my school were what you would call low income. Most of the families in our neighborhood didn't have a car, certainly not 2 cars, and many families did not participate in extracurricular activities that cost any kind of money to do. And a lot of parents did not take their kids on vacations to parks. I wanted to do things like scouting, but that was not a financial priority for us. My job was to help with the business, painting anything from 4 foot down, washing paintbrushes, I think, with gasoline with my bare hands, carrying supplies. I think I was 10 before I realized that DAP spackling compound was not silly putty. But nowhere in anyone in my mom's family to that point, no one had graduated from college. But my own story is that despite this financial situation, I got to see a lot of parks and gardens. There were pocket municipal parks. There were city parks I could walk to with friends and sneak into camp sessions. There were state parks where family milestones would be marked with casseroles made from what grew in our yard and hefty servings of warm potato salad that didn't give us botulism. We did own one giant 400-pound tent that I think was bought from an Army-Navy surplus store and was only meant to be used like 2 or 3 feet from the back of the Ford Galaxy 800. I did eventually get to see a handful of national parks. There were parks like Blue Ridge Parkway, Great Smoky Mountains, and then way up in the northern state of Virginia, we drove through Shenandoah. It was really going far. Mostly, we visited anything that you could drive to in a few hours that didn't have an entrance fee and wasn't too expensive. A couple of times, we even visited where my dad was from, which is way up north of the Mason-Dixon in Pennsylvania, where his dad worked for U.S. Steel for 40 years. Highlights of that trip for me, this is my family. We would go to like the Hershey factory, the Lebanon bologna plant, and we would eat sandwiches with white bread from the trunk of our cars. But who knew that would get applause? But along the way, we managed to visit a heck of a lot of historic sites, boyhood homes, and birthplaces. I'm pretty sure that's why my parents divorced. One summer, I was shipped off to extended family in Maryland, and they had a bit more means than we did. My aunt was working for the National Institute of Health, and I got to see the Washington Monument, the White House, the Smithsonian, and many of these other historic sites for the first time, and I was absolutely fascinated by every bit of it. I read every wayside. Thank you to those of you who have created waysides. If you don't know those folks, they're amazing. They have to get you to understand what's important about a site without even being there to do it. I collected every brochure. I completed every activity at every site I visited. And I was lucky that even back in South Carolina, I had uncles who were sort of free-range uncles when they were out of the Navy. One was, I think, an artist and explorer. I'm not really sure what he did. But he did end up climbing Rainier, and he brought back slide film of most of his trip, I think. And, you know, his 1970s adventures involved being out here in the Cascades and slogging up Rainier. And when I was in South Carolina at the end of that summer, I'm laying on the floor, the hardwood floors. I'm just sticking to the hardwood floors because we didn't have air conditioning. And I'm watching these slides of foreign lands with snow and glacial ice and unusual tools and coils of rope and bearded men wearing tie-dyes. It was like a National Geographic magazine. And it maybe was in the bus, I'm guessing. I think they did actually drive in a Volkswagen. They're everywhere, Hillary, they're everywhere. So later, as I sat in the back seat, sleeping on the back dash, because that was the safest place you would sleep, on the back dash of the Ford Galaxie 800. I would have my face against the glass. And I got to see pictures of Rainier on the slideshow. And then I was listening to the AM radio in the car when Mount St. Helens erupted. And I got to hear about that on AM radio. And I could never have imagined in my childhood that my career would bring me here. But when I was in elementary school in South Carolina, I got lucky. Not that kind of lucky. Different. A brand new national monument was being opened in 1976. Congaree Swamp National Monument. They thought of better names for parks after that, but lucky for me, our school was not too far away. And when they began having ranger programs in the late 70s, our school principal, who was really ahead of his time, he wanted all the students to experience them. The park was way the hell past public transit like Rainier and Olympic and North Cascades. And they packed the kids in the bus anyway. I'm pretty sure we had 6 or 7 kids on every seat. And we went, and I remember that long drive, and you left the capital city of South Carolina, and you left the sounds of the city and the smells and the horns, and you changed subtly and quickly to country. And then you had the country smells, and then that went from country to forest. And then as you got even closer to the park, the forest turned to swamp. And I remember that last very long kind of mile on the gravel, and the trees got bigger and darker, and there was this creepy ranger shack at the end of the road. And I was like, what is happening? I think they had one bathroom, and we spent our first 45 minutes in line to use it. But then we met the ranger. He was wearing a uniform like a lot of our rangers, not quite this formal, but he had that cool hat, and he was amazing. He was larger than life. His name was Fran. He was mesmerizing. He took us on a walk. He told stories. He brought the park alive. He dug his hands up to the elbows in muck, and he hooted like an owl, and he listened for the owls to call back, and they did. He wasn't like anybody else I'd ever met. He was fun, and he was amazing, and he had all of my attention. Some kids were bored, but I was transfixed. He deftly wove science with history and the story of how the park was created and what creatures inhabited the place, and he made them not scary. I couldn't believe I didn't know these things about this place that was really close to my home. And I went home and told my family, and I made them to promise to bring me back. In our parks, right now, sitting among you, we have people who bring the parks alive. Our guides, our education specialists, our interpreters, our historic landscape architects, our media specialists, our law enforcement rangers, they each play a role in connecting youth and families with our park. And their good work is supplemented by other staff and other divisions and volunteers who engage young people in citizen science and volunteer projects and get their hands dirty and their feet dirty and make their faces sweat. Some of them travel to schools in person or virtually, and others work closely with the schools to tailor park lessons to state curriculum goals and standards, and they create meaningful tools to bring into schools and communities. They make one trip to the park incredibly valuable for a park. They tie it to as many lessons as they can, and they allow these young people and then their families to develop connections with the park. They allow people to make their own stories with the park and to experience something special. These staff and volunteers are inspiring people who've dedicated their lives to the work. They wear the uniform with pride. They're creative, imaginative, resourceful, and they forge connections with other organizations like Washington's National Park Fund to deepen our impact. They find the resources to support the partners and the partnerships. For some kids, it might just be another trip away from class, like some of the kids on my bus, but for others, it's like the lighting of a fire. But not all schools can get the students to the parks. The trips are long. They're expensive. Traveling takes a lot of resources, and it takes a lot of resources to develop, operate, and maintain traveling exhibits. Having a ranger to connect with the staff when they finally do make it to the park, either with their schools or on their own, is really hard when staffing is stretched thin. And that's where our partners like Washington's National Park Fund come in to provide us with that support, and that's where you come in. For me, I was lucky. I had the chance to connect with a ranger really early in my life. And I was able to keep connecting with other sites and trips and opportunities. And what I didn't know then, but I do know now, and the message that I have for you is that I didn't know growing up that many times my participation was often made possible because of our financial need and because of the kindness and generosity of donors. It's very likely that I wouldn't have made that trip to Congaree if it weren't for a PTA that raised funds and if it weren't for a trailblazing school principal. And one day, I would return to Congaree as that park's superintendent over 30 years later, and that ranger was still there. And I got to host his retirement celebration. If it weren't for donors and it weren't for people who underwrote these experiences, I wouldn't have spent the night in a zoo and dissected an owl pellet with a scientist. I wouldn't have been able to travel across the country to be in academic experiences because we didn't have the means. So later for me, when time came for choosing college and grad school and my eventual career, I know that my early experiences with the national parks no doubt played a role. I had a chance for the first time ever to go west of the Mississippi when I was in college, and it was only because someone else paid for the trip. It wasn't a sports team I was on, it was an academic team, and those are pretty hard to fund. We didn't sell as many tickets to the World Geography Bowl. But I knew when I flew across the Rockies and my face was crammed up against the window in the aisle seat, when I saw the Rockies for the first time, I knew I had to return west, so I went back to South Carolina. I learned how to rock climb. And the next summer, I took a job in Colorado teaching climbing to young women. And I connected with girls who were in many cases making their own first connections to the land through backpacking trips in the Terrials and Pike National Forest in Colorado. And after grad school, I had the chance to come to the Park Service for a career, and I've been here ever since. But make no mistake about it, the reason I'm here is because the fire was lit by a ranger doing a program for 40 other annoying kids in a national park in South Carolina, funded by donors. I don't expect each and every life to be that's touched by our interpretation and education programs to become the green and gray, a Park Service employee. But when we connect, who knows what can happen? It can only be a good thing if all of the electricians, scientists, stay-at-home parents, laborers, chefs, investment bankers, musicians, retail strategists, legislators, bus drivers, and dancers grow up with an awareness of and an appreciation for their personal connections to the public lands. Our protected lands inspire people, and those people bring others. Soon we'll have the next generation of stewards, and this room will be full again. So thank you for helping us achieve our mission. Through serving youth and families in the National Park Service, all of us in the green and gray, and the volunteers, and the 22,000 others like us around the country appreciate your support and your belief in what we do.